I'm going to welcome you a second time to our forum on creation care and on how we can enter into Lent as people who care about creation, but also as simply people of God. Richard's going to talk to us about Lenten practices, and then we have a guest speaker today, Susan Schorr. Susan is the co-lead of single-use plastics and a member of the Washington, D.C. Zero Waste Committee. And she just knows an awful lot about the topic. So we have her to talk to us about the dangers, about the history and of single-use plastics, and about ways that we can change our behavior. So first we'll begin with, and thank you, Susan, for being here. Thank you, Richard, for speaking. And we'll begin with Richard.
So before we turn to the practical, my job is to offer some thoughts in the theological realm to answer the question, why are we focusing on creation care with a particular intent as a parish in Lent? And so to answer that question, I have to explore, ask, and answer a few other questions first. What is Lent? What is sin? What is grace? And then I'll come back to why creation care in Lent. So you heard a fantastic sermon from Diana today, a bit about what is Lent. And just to lay the groundwork so we're all coming from the same place, it's a season of preparation. The church has two great feasts. One celebrates the birth of Christ in the Incarnation, the Feast of the Nativity, and the other celebrates the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus, the Lent to Easter to Pentecost cycle. And both the Christmas season and the Easter season have these times of preparation. And also, as Diana mentioned, 40 days. And if you count all of the days between Ash Wednesday and the Easter Vigil, you actually get 46. Subtract the 6 Sundays that fall in Lent, because Sundays are always a feast, because on Sundays we celebrate the Eucharist, and it's always a celebration of a mini Easter all throughout the year. So, in fact, if you are fasting from your cakes and so forth, Sunday is a day to take off. I think Diana covered well the symbolism of the number 40, so I'll skip through some of this, but I think most applicable is, of course, the gospel reading from today that Diana referenced, Jesus' temptation in the wilderness for 40 days, mirroring his tribe, his people, the ancient Israelites, who wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and Moses, who spent 40 days up talking with God. But it's also, and I kind of forgotten this, I think I've heard it before, but I don't think of it centrally to the number 40, but many point out that Jesus lay in the tomb for 40 hours between the afternoon of Good Friday and dawn on Easter Day. And so what are we called to do during this preparatory season before we go to celebrate the resurrection? Our Book of Common Prayer in the Ash Wednesday liturgy includes an invitation to a Holy Lent. And there are 4 tasks specifically that we're invited to undertake in Lent: self-examination and repentance, prayer, fasting and self-denial, and reading and meditating on God's holy word. So why do we do these things in which we somewhat limit ourselves and deny ourselves from pleasures, as Diana mentioned, and do this extra self-examination that presumably as disciples of Christ we're doing all year round, but why especially in Lent? And I think the answer basically is because it's an acknowledgement of how we fall short. The Lent to Easter to Pentecost cycle in our church year is really about the relationship between sin and grace. It's the relationship between us and God. So we actually can't talk about Lent and Easter without talking about sin. The reason that we're asked to fast and reflect and to turn back to God is because we are a sinful people. The prayer book defines sin as the seeking of our own will instead of the will of God. I heard a seminary professor claim that really the best way to describe sin is that it's about broken relationship. I like that definition better. It's a broken relationship between us and God, between us and others, and between us and God's creation. Sin in many traditions, maybe the one you grew up in, I don't know, somewhat in the tradition I was raised, sin has been used as a weapon against many who find themselves on the margins of society. And in this way, a particular focus on sin is unhelpful, to dwell in one's depravity. And yet those traditions kind of gloss over and avoid the confrontation of corporate and social sin. In fact, if we want to follow what the Bible says more literally, which at St. Margaret's we don't, but for those who do, it would actually be more literal to care more about corporate sin, because the Bible talks so much more about the corporate and social sins of ancient Israel than it does about individual acts of misgiving and wrongdoing. So yes, there's an individual component to our fasting and our self-denial and to our meditation on God's holy word, but there also is a communal, which is why we're doing this here, starting to get closer and closer to the answer of why in Lent. So that's sin, but see, we also can't talk about sin then without talking about grace. I stumbled across a quote from a liturgical theologian named Patrick Malloy, who serves as the canon presenter at St. John the Divine Cathedral in New York City. He writes that Lenten penitence is rooted in the Church's sense that it has not lived up to the undeserved and unearned baptismal grace. And we're not doing these things, fasting and self-denying and praying more. We're not doing those things to earn our way back. We're not earning those experiences of grace. The grace exists already. That's why we call it amazing. It's there all the time. We don't deserve it, but God grants it. And so, in realizing how much grace we've been given by God and how much we fall short of living as if we have received such grace, we're called to turn back. The word repent, many people point out, really the root etymology of the word is the verb to turn. To turn our attention back to Christ, back to God. To work on the reconciling nature of the broken relationship that sin is all about. Between us and God, between us and our neighbor, between us and God's creation. Any Sunday school graduates in the room who were taught to memorize the definition of a sacrament, an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. The Catechism defines grace as God's favor toward us, unearned and undeserved. And by grace, God does four things: forgives our sins, enlightens our minds, stirs our hearts, and strengthens our wills. So in sum, we need this season of Lent. We need this preparatory time in which we dwell on the fact that the way of love that we celebrate at St. Margaret's and in our church traditions, the way of love, the way of Jesus, is also the way of the cross. Because you need the duality of the cross, of Good Friday and Easter Sunday, of resurrection. You need both. Because it's through Christ's life and then death and then resurrection that we participate in Christ's life, death, and resurrection. Patrick Malloy also talks about how the events of Christ's life, death, and resurrection, we're not simply remembering them from 2,000 years ago. They're here, today, now. Lent and Easter are about acknowledging that Christ is happening. Christ's mission in the world is happening through us now. And so I would argue that Lent is really all about responding to God's grace and figuring out what in the world does it mean that this grace is so amazing that it's on offer, and yet we as humans have failed to live up to that grace received. And so to the point of why are we doing this as a parish in the season of Lent, I come back to those four jobs, those 4 invitations we receive in the Ash Wednesday liturgy. For me, on a personal level, this is my testimony moment. For me, on a personal level, last Lent, so a year ago, when I was discerning how do I want to mark my Lent in a way, I've done a lot of, over the years of giving ups. Did caffeine one year, that do not recommend. And then, I think also popular, and which I commend as well, is more of a taking on, adding to our practices, not just giving up. And so a different way of praying. But last year in particular, I was feeling called to that giving up practice, to fasting in a way. And as a cradle Roman Catholic, we didn't eat meat on Fridays. It was part of our practice. And I decided that in that vein, I was going to eat less meat last Lent. And the more and more I did it, the more and more I found that it wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be. And so I expanded between not just eating no meat on Fridays, but not eating meat on other days of the week. And then I just kind of challenged myself to ask, how many days a week could I really abstain from eating meat? Fast forward to the first week of Easter. The priest, we tend to take a few days off right after Easter Sunday. It's been a very busy season, Holy Week. And when I was, with my feet up in my lounger in our TV room at the rectory, the algorithms on Netflix were luring me in, and right that week, a new release came on Netflix, and it was Seaspiracy, a film about the corruption of our worldwide fishing industry. And that film compelled me to never want to eat a fish again. And of course, the algorithms do what they do, and showed me another film that is rather older than Seaspiracy, but its cousin, not made by the same people. And it was called Cowspiracy. And it talked about how, for those of us who care so much about the climate and about reducing greenhouse gases, it's kind of socially acceptable to critique the fossil fuels. But what still has not caught on is the fact that cows' farts and burps are what create the most methane gas in the world. That we are killing forests to accommodate our desire to consume beef. And so after Easter, I made a decision that I was going to try and be vegan. And I mention this story because it was a faith journey for me. It wasn't kind of a social consciousness awakening. There was a component to that, but I did all of these things out of my desire to grow closer in my relationship with God and take seriously the mandates we're given to care for God's creation. And so fast forward to as we're preparing for this season of Lent at St. Margaret's, I have in the back of my mind some ways that my vegan mentors, Suzanne DeFelice and Richard Villeminay, and others who might be closeted vegans out there, how we could do a little evangelism in the vegan category, but that is a big hill to climb. An equally big, but I felt more accessible, perhaps, hill to climb would be the area of plastics. Susan will talk to us about their history, the kind of myth of recycling, inviting ourselves to shift from a mindset of, I use it once and I throw it away, to why do we create so many things that are only intended to be used once? And so these self-examination, repentance, prayer, fasting, and self-denial, we can do all four of these things through the lens as a corporate community and do them by trying to reduce our reliance on plastic and single-use products, which includes the paper Starbucks cups. From the Litany of Penitence in the Ash Wednesday service, we confessed for our waste and pollution of your creation and our lack of concern for those who come after us. Accept our repentance, Lord, we prayed. And so this is why we have chosen as a parish to draw our attention to creation care in Lent. So there's a lot of 101 theology for you. I'm happy to pause for any burning questions that you may have before I turn it over to Susan.
So if you have a question about sin, or not that you'd want to talk about sin, but this would be the time to do it, or the way of the cross, or, we don't always sort of just get deeply into theology, which Richard has done such a great job of just bringing it together. So if there's a word there, a term there, or there's a what? Me, sin? Question? Please ask it now. Okay, I'll ask you a question. What does it really mean to follow the way of the cross? And do we do that all the time? And is that a Lenten practice? And can you talk a little bit more about what that phrase means?
I can talk about what it means to me personally.
Okay.
When the presiding bishop came out with this new rule of life, the way of love, rule of life, which we've studied when it first came out a couple of years ago at St. Margaret's, the 7 practices to live a Jesus-centered life. The presiding bishop is also known as talking about Jesus is all about the way of love. And it occurred to me that first Lent, after the Way of Love kind of program had been launched, that Lent is the season in which we realize and remember that the way of love is also the way of the cross. That somehow the way that we as Christians in Christ chose to show love was through sacrifice, was through suffering. I can't do justice to a theological exploration of suffering before turning the mic to Susan, but what the way of the cross really means to me personally is not making assumptions that I know why, because we can't know why suffering exists in the world, or why though I don't think I've done anything wrong to deserve suffering, still experience it. That the way of the cross helps me remember that when I am in that midst of suffering, or when any one of us is, that Christ knows what that's about. And Christ has experienced it himself, and is experiencing it with me when I'm suffering. Because of the cross. Because of the cross. And that's what it means to me. Thanks for the question. I think we should turn it over to Susan.
Can you all hear me? Great. Okay. Well, let me just start out by saying thank you to St. Margaret's Church, to Diana and Richard for inviting me to speak today. It's really a pleasure to be with you, and I can't tell you how impressed I am with your decision to try to give up single-use plastic for Lent. It's such a fantastic idea, so bravo to you. I thought I might start by sharing with you how I got into this, and also just to mention that while I'm very active in the Sierra Club, I am a volunteer there. So I know a little bit about the whole plastic issue, but it's not my job. I'm not a professional in this area. Everything that I do is kind of as an amateur volunteer. So I just wanted to couch my remarks that way. So how did I get started in this? Well, as I shared with Diana, for many years I worked and lived in Geneva, Switzerland. I worked for a specialized United Nations agency over there. And I worked pretty hard. So that meant that I usually ate my lunch at my desk. Not a very European practice, I might say. And I would go down to the cafeteria at work, and I would get a selection of items from the salad bar, and I would put it in a single-use plastic takeout container, and I would grab usually a single-use plastic bottle of water, and I would grab utensils and napkins, and eat my lunch at my desk, and then, except for the bottles, because we had recycling on site, I would throw everything in my waste paper basket in my office. And because I was working pretty late at night, I was usually there when the maintenance crew came and picked up my now overflowing garbage pail. And I did this like practically every day. And then one day, and I didn't think about it at all because I was so busy and consumed by my job, by my family, and just by life. And I don't know exactly what I can attribute this to, but one day it was as if the scales fell from my eyes, and I said, I can't continue to do this anymore. I looked at that overflowing garbage pail at the end of the day, and I said, I'm not gonna do this anymore. And I brought in a reusable container from home. I talked to the cafeteria manager in French, and I asked her if she could weigh my container so they could deduct the tare weight from my future salad bar purchases. She was absolutely delighted with it and took her some time to figure it out, but we finally did that. And I brought in that reusable container, I brought in a water carafe, I brought in utensils from home, I brought in dish detergent, and I washed the stuff after I had every meal. And I used only reusables for my lunch from that point forward. And I also decided that when I retired from the UN, and I was just a couple years away from retirement at that point, that I would devote at least part of my retirement to fighting single-use plastic. So I moved back to Washington, D.C. at the very end of 2018, and one of the first things I did in 2019 was join the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Sierra Club's, their Zero Waste committee. And at first I was just a member, but I participated a lot, and eventually I became the co-lead of the single-use plastic subcommittee, and more recently this year I took over as the chair of the Zero Waste Committee. And because I'm convinced that reusable foodware and packaging is key to solving our plastic crisis, I also joined another group called the National Reuse Network, and they promote policy and business decisions in order to promote to replace single-use disposables with reusables. So from being involved in both the Sierra Club and the National Reuse Network, I've learned a lot along the way. And again, just to highlight that I'm speaking in my individual capacity today. I'm not here promoting the views of the Sierra Club or the National Reuse Network. So what's up with single-use plastic? The plastic crisis has unfolded during my lifetime. For any of you who are as old as I am, I'm in my mid-60s, you probably remember a time when you could go to a grocery store and not return with so many of your goods packaged in plastic, or have a cashier take something that's already wrapped in plastic and wrap it in another plastic bag before sticking it in your grocery bag. A time when milk and condiments and many other, Patty spoke about mayonnaise, okay? When you could buy mayonnaise and ketchup and honey in glass. How many of you remember those times? Yeah, okay, quite a few. So in fact, the single-use plastic bag, the grocery bag, was only introduced into grocery stores in 1979. And Kroger and Safeway introduced them in 1982, which is exactly 40 years ago today. So this is all unfolded in our lifetimes. We've been seeing this. And since the introduction of this plastic bag in our grocery stores, and accelerating in the past decade or so. It seems that just about everything in the grocery store is wrapped in plastic. So the question is did this just happen? I mean, or is there something going on here? And here's what I've learned. I'm going to share some big numbers with you and then get into some more details. So about 300 million tons of plastic is produced each year globally, and packaging makes up 40% of the plastic that we use. 99% of plastic is made from fossil fuels. The rest is largely bioplastic. The US burns or landfills 32 million tons of plastic each year, making us the largest plastic waste producer in the world. Incinerators and landfills are often located in neighborhoods where people of color live, making them an environmental justice concern as well. What about here in DC? Did you know, I only found this out quite recently, the DC incinerator is located in Lorton, Virginia. It's a community that is comprised 54% of people of color. So all the plastic we send to the incinerator is affecting these communities. Globally, at least 10 million tons of plastic is estimated to enter our oceans every year. This week I saw an update on that of 11 million tons. It's a lot. All of this plastic gets into the environment and it gets into us. A 2019 study out of Australia said we all ingest about a credit card's worth of plastic every week. That's terrifying. And there are growing concerns with the toxic nature of plastic, including a chemical called PFAS and other similar forever chemicals, they're called, that are believed to negatively impact our health. It is absolutely no accident that we're noticing more plastic in our daily lives. Plastic production doubled in the last 20 years. It's projected to double again over the coming 20 years and to quadruple by the early 2050s. How about here in DC? Any guesses on how much plastic trash is generated here? Anybody want to venture a guess? Okay. The latest projection from the Department of Public Works, DPW, in DC, is that we will produce nearly 143,000 tons of plastic trash next year. That's a lot of plastic. But, unfortunately, DC is also projecting that we are only going to achieve a 6.5% recycling rate, which is far lower than the 9% national average. This story is repeated in cities and towns across the US and abroad, although I must say our neighbors in Montgomery County are doing a better job of diverting their waste from landfills and incinerators. What's behind the mass increase in plastic production? Ironically and sadly, the fossil fuel industry is changing its business model to launch more plastic production facilities as we move to clean energy such as renewable wind and solar. I'm not blaming this on wind and solar. I want to be very clear. Organizations like the Sierra Club totally support renewable energy, and I just installed solar panels on the roof of my house a couple of weeks ago. The problem is that instead of focusing more on investing in clean energy, the fossil fuel industry has sought to pivot to plastic production. And this is documented in a report called The New Coal, Plastics and Climate Change, issued last year by a group called Beyond Plastic, which is housed at Bennington College in Vermont. And I think I included that in my list of resources, and Diana has put it on your website. So the New Coal documents how greenhouse gas emissions from plastic production will surpass those of coal-fired power by 2030. It's 8 years from now. According to the New Coal, at least 40, and I'm quoting, at least 42 plastic facilities have opened since 2019, are under construction, or are in the permitting process. If these become fully operational, these new plastic plants could release an additional 55 million tons of greenhouse gases. the equivalent of another 27 average-sized coal plants. And of course, many of these plastic production facilities, like the incinerators and landfills we just talked about, tend to be located in communities of color and are bringing with them serious health consequences. So, with so many new plastic production facilities opened up or in the works, it's no longer surprising to witness the doubling of plastic production and the ever-growing presence of single-use plastic packaging in our grocery stores and our restaurants. The plastic industry has tried for years to shift responsibility for managing the disposal of plastic food packaging onto consumers like us and trash haulers and even poor developing nations by promoting recycling as the only solution to the growing mounds of plastic waste it produces. But there's no way that municipal recycling facilities can keep up with this ever-increasing plastic production, even if we improved our recycling rates from the national 9.9% average and 6.5% here in DC. And increasingly, our food packaging is made up of multi-layered materials, like the growing number of resealable pouches like this one that package our rice, our sugar, our other staples, part of the vegan diet. DC, like most municipalities, are unable to recycle these multi-layered plastic products. For me, the rise in plastic packaging conjures an image of the Sorcerer's Apprentice. How many of you remember that old Mickey Mouse cartoon where Mickey Mouse has cast a spell to try to create more food and the pots are overflowing? But instead of cooking pots overflowing and out of control, there's a seemingly endless supply of plastic packaging. So I'm sure you'd agree with me, and clearly you do because of your Lenten practice, that it's time for a change. So what can we do? We need systemic change. It's time to say goodbye to our current throwaway paradigm and create systems designed to prevent waste from happening in the first place. What would a waste prevention model look like? One, companies that produce plastic packaging would bear responsibility for the full life cycle of their products. And we, as consumers, would give more thought to what happens to the products we buy. These systemic changes would incentivize companies to adopt sustainable packaging choices, by which I mean reusable packaging. New legal requirements would mean that plastic packaging producers could no longer shirk all responsibility for the waste they produce and continue to foist that responsibility onto the shoulders of consumers like us and city trash holders who now bear the expense of recycling, incineration, and landfilling. So if you're not sure what I mean about reusable packaging, think of the glass milk bottle delivery systems. Some of us had these in our childhood, but they're also making a bit of a resurgence here in DC. I think one of the companies is the South Mountain Creamery. Maybe you've seen your neighbors get these milk bottles delivered to their doorstep. They're delivered by dairies, and then those same dairies pick up the dirties, bring them back, wash and sanitize, and refill them. That's what I mean by reusable packaging. But this can also be done for a lot of other products, not just milk. Up in Tacoma Park, there's a company called Paradigm One, and they are doing reusable takeout containers. So, and we're in the Sierra Club trying to work on bringing those to DC as well. But it's the same model. A customer gets their takeout food in a reusable container. They bring them back to either the restaurant where they ate at or a kiosk where they can drop it off. And the company picks up the dirties, washes, sanitizes, and then brings back a clean supply to the restaurant. It can also happen with laundry powder. So, and I just want to say, like, I'm not promoting any of the products that I'm going to show you today. These are just some of the things that I use. This is a refillable product. It hasn't gone into that whole circular economy model just yet. But there also is a store in Tacoma Park called the Refillable. And they have huge bins of laundry detergent, and they sell them in these reusable containers. Now, unfortunately, they don't have a delivery system. They're not in mainstream grocery stores. I have to go to Tacoma Park, but I buy this, and I bring back my container, and they refill it again and again and again with the laundry powder. So that's what I'm talking about. And encouragingly, these refillable grocery models are being piloted right now in Portland, Oregon. Why the emphasis on reusables? It's because they prevent waste from happening. You know, think of all the containers of laundry detergent, those big, you know, thick plastic pour bottles. I'm not buying anymore, and I am not sending it to a landfill or an incinerator. So how do we get to this new paradigm of producing less plastic and preventing waste? I'd like to share a couple of policy responses and then get into things that we can all do. So a new national poll by the nonprofit group Oceana shows that 8 in 10 voters nationwide support local, state, and national policies to reduce single-use plastic. At the federal level, a bill has been introduced in Congress called called the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. It's a comprehensive piece of legislation. It includes, for example, a national bottle bill, a deposit bill, requirements for producers of plastic packaging to take responsibility for the full life cycle of their products, and temporary limits on plastic production facilities. Currently, this comprehensive legislation is being broken up into standalone bills, such as one for a national bottle bill, in an effort to get some of the measures passed. I am sure that representatives and senators would love to hear from their constituents that they support either the larger or the more targeted bills. At the state level, some states have moved to ban single-use grocery bags. Laws in New Jersey and New York recently went into effect to that end. Some towns in Massachusetts have banned single-use produce bags, while other towns in the Bay State have banned single-use plastic water bottles. The idea is that consumers will adopt reusable grocery and produce bags as well as reusable water bottles like my own. DC, as I'm sure you know, does not have a grocery store bag ban. Instead, stores charge 5 cents for every single-use plastic bag a customer takes, and the idea is that would disincentivize their use. The problem is, DC collects about $2 million a year from the bag fees, and they use it for some very worthy environmental programs. But the problem is that that's introducing 40 million single-use plastic bags into our environment every year. So some would ask, wouldn't it be better to fund those programs through our general revenue than through a bag fee? By the way, those single-use plastic bags cannot go into the blue recycling bins. If they do, they tend to choke and clog the recycling equipment. And if you do have a collection of these film bags, some grocery stores do collect them, and they sell them to a company that makes Trex decking out of them. So that's better than them winding up in an incinerator or a landfill, but it's not the best use of our limited resources. So I'm sure many of you are considering giving up these plastic bags for Lent. I definitely encourage, I'm sure you know this already, but they come in many different types. They come in cloth, they come in plastic-coated ones. Every reusable bag apparently replaces 700 single-use bags. So that would be like a huge step if you could do that. That is true waste prevention. In addition, and I think Patty mentioned this, you can switch to reusable produce bags. And like the reusable grocery bags, they come in a variety of shapes and sizes. These are 2 that I have. Some are made from fabric, some are from a plastic mesh. I found some for sale, although they were quite hidden, in the produce section of my local Chevy Chase DC Safeway. But if you can't find them in your grocery store, then you can definitely order them online. What I do is I just keep them in my reusable grocery bags, which I hang by my front door, so that I just get in the habit of always having them with me. And depends how much produce you eat, but you know, I have quite a collection of these produce bags. What else can we do? Well, it is possible, and Patty also mentioned this, to find alternatives to certain products that are usually sold in plastic containers. You mentioned the shampoo and conditioner bars. And there are also bulk goods that you can buy. You can get, this is a solid bar of body lotion. So you can rub it on yourself, and it comes in this lovely little wooden container. And this is dish soap, but it comes in it's like a shampoo bar, except that it's dish soap. So there are increasing numbers of these products. Then there are refillable models, and I'll show you one of these. This comes from a company. It sells all kinds of personal care items: shampoo, conditioner, body lotion, body wash, face creams, etc., in these metal containers, and you have to buy a pump. But when you finish it, you mail it back to the company. They wash and sanitize it, and then they refill it and sell the product again. Wouldn't it be great if that was just on your grocery store shelves? I mean, that's, you know, it's nice to have these. You have really committed people, like parishioners here at St. Margaret's, that might be willing to do that, but we need to make it a little bit more mainstream. There are different models too. Some companies sell cleaning products in a concentrate format. So instead of buying like a large plastic bottle of dishwashing liquid, you get a little tab, you fill it with water, shake it up, and then you have your dishwashing liquid. Some people, as Patty mentioned, are already making their own cleaning products using old-fashioned ingredients. And you can also do your own refillables. So we do it with olive oil. We buy a huge can of olive oil, and we decant that into a glass bottle and keep using it over again. I make my own yogurt too, and then I reuse these jam jars and put my yogurt in that. So, you know, there are all kinds of things that you can do to be creative. How about water? Before I moved to Switzerland, almost 30 years ago now, I don't remember that Americans were drinking all that much bottled water. This also seems to be a slightly new trend. But over the years, bottled water companies have convinced us somehow that we need bottled water. But do we really need bottled water? Do we really want to reward companies for selling us something that just comes out of our tap? In my house, we have completely given up bottled water. We do have a nice in-house filter, so our water tastes just fine. And we invested in a soda maker so that we can make sparkling water on the occasions that we need that. And we have reusable water bottles that we take religiously with us outside the house. We also keep a set of cloth napkins and utensils in the car if we're on a road trip. This is a really nice model. A colleague of mine in the Sierra Club offered to make this for our annual silent auction, a fundraising activity, and I was lucky enough to bid the highest price and get it, but it's got my, just from home, you know, knife, fork, spoon, and also a metal straw. So we have those and we don't have to take plastic with us. Patty also mentioned making homemade yogurts. That's something I do as well. Another thing you might not think about is I grow herbs. Because it seems most of the herbs that we buy in grocery stores are wrapped in plastic. So if you're able to have your own little herb garden, then you can avoid all of that plastic too. and I look for the unwrapped produce as much as possible so I can put it straight into my reusable produce bags. What about recycling? If you're not sure if something should go in the blue bin, it's really best to check, because you don't want to engage in wish cycling and contaminate what is in there that could otherwise be recycled. So there are two sources for you. They're in the list of resources. One is DPW maintains a website called What Goes Where. The link is on your website now, and you can check out what products can and cannot go in. But for me, the best resource to go to is a young woman named Charlotte Dreisen. She's on Twitter. I've shared her Twitter account. You tweet at her, and she will usually get back quite quickly. You send her a picture, can I recycle this? And she'll let you know. She used to work at Department of Public Works, and she's very knowledgeable. In DC, there are a number of initiatives to reduce plastic foodware in restaurants. How many of you were aware that as of January 1st, restaurants should no longer automatically include plastic utensils, condiments, and napkins in your takeout orders? Seeing quite a few. Are you finding that they're complying with that? No. Okay. Yeah. So the Sierra Club volunteers have been going around to restaurants. We have Department of Environment and Energy made up these flyers to inform restaurants, and they've apparently mailed them to 6,000 restaurants. But we are actually handing these out to restaurants, and we would welcome more volunteers who might want to join us. The problem, as you mentioned, one of the problems is the apps are not complying. So what we did in the Sierra Club is we took screenshots when we were not finding them in compliance, and we shared them with DOEE, and we understand that they've started an investigation. They can't tell us much about it, but they do have a tip line, and I've included the link for the tip line. So if you're seeing things that they shouldn't be doing, I know that they would appreciate that so that they can follow up. DOEE is giving restaurants 6 months to get with the program. So they're not going to start finding anybody until July. But the food ordering apps were supposed to have changed their platforms July last year. So the time is right for enforcement. And I'm sure the more they hear from consumers, the more they can follow up with them. The Zero Waste Act has also moved to try to incentivize restaurants to adopt reusable instead of disposable foodware. Here I'm talking about plates, cups, utensils, takeout containers. Their DOE is providing a modest amount of grant money to enable restaurants to purchase reusable foodware, dishwashing capacity. Are you talking about DC local or national? DC local, okay? So they are launching a small grants program. Restaurants in DC would be eligible. Food trucks, cafeterias would all be eligible to apply for grant money. And this grant money would enable them either to buy reusable foodware if they're, say that they're like a casual restaurant that uses plastic baskets to serve. They could buy other kinds of products if they wanted to, or sometimes it's not the problem that they don't have the reusable foodware, but they don't have dishwashing capacity. So they can also get dishwashing capacity to wash and reuse these materials, and also to help these companies like these reusable takeout container companies. So there's like $200,000 this year that went into the DC budget. We're going to be advocating for more budget for next year, but the grants program should come online. They say this spring. It's starting to look like spring to me outside, and they have these little flyers, and we're passing those out too. So those are the kinds of things that we would love to have volunteers help us with. On the horizon, I did mention, I think, beverage container deposits up in the context of the national law that's being proposed. DC could have a law like this. 10 states across the country have a law where when you buy a bottle or can of soda or water, you pay a small deposit between 5 and 15 cents. And then when you finish it, you bring it back to the store or a redemption center and you get your deposit back. Sierra Club very much supports these laws because they're amazingly effective in terms of reducing litter and help beverage companies to get clean stock that they can then reuse these materials or break them down and make new bottles with them. It's a very circular approach. Unfortunately, DC was not able to pass a bottle law when it was introduced in the late 1980s. We see that conditions are starting to change. Some companies are eager to burnish their sustainability reputations, and they have committed to using a proportion of recycled materials in their bottles. And some states out in the West Coast require minimum recycled content requirements. So that's tipping the balance more in favor of beverage container deposit schemes. We're currently conducting brand audits to document which other companies' products are we finding in DC that have been illegally dumped. And we do these with other organizations that set up trash cleanups. We know that some churches organize trash cleanups. So if St. Margaret's decides to do a trash cleanup, let us know, and maybe we could do a brand audit on the side of your cleanup. We did one at the Anacostia Riverkeepers cleanup on January 22nd. It was part of the Martin Luther King Day of Service. Anacostia Riverkeepers mobilized over 100 volunteers, and they retrieved more than 1,600 plastic bottles in less than 3 hours from the Pope Branch Park and Stream. So it's a very isolated place, a very specific place. 3 hours, 1,600 bottles, and the top polluters we found that day were Nestle, whose Deer Park water bottles were everywhere, along with PepsiCo, Cloverleaf Dairy, and the Coca-Cola Company. So I bet you if DC had a beverage container deposit law, we would no longer be able to find 1,600 plastic bottles in a 3-hour period in just one small park in DC. So that's a lot to think about. I think the important thing to take away is there's a lot you can do, and whatever you do will have an impact. You can start with the kind of personal action that you all have planned for Lent, but I expect that in addition to using less plastic than before and learning new habits that will enable you to reduce plastic throughout the year, you may follow a similar journey that I did and start seeing plastic everywhere and discovering more things you do about it. It's kind of like your journey to becoming a vegan. You start with a small step, and then it grows. So you might decide to talk with your favorite restaurants about respecting the new serve on request requirements. They definitely need to hear that message. You can encourage them to convert to reusable foodware for on-site dining and apply for one of the grants. But you can do completely different things. Maybe you work with activities like Meals on Wheels. There's another program, Sierra Club has nothing to do with it, but they're working to convince local Meals on Wheels organizations to serve their meals on reusable foodware, and just think of all the plastic that could be prevented if they did that. So if that's of interest to you, I'd be happy to put you in touch with the team that is organizing that. You could talk to your kids' schools about moving back to reusables in their cafeterias, or installing water bottle refill stations so kids could bring their reusable water bottles from home and fill them with clean water. Or maybe going back to old-fashioned milk dispensers. Those who are active politically back home can contact their elected officials to support the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. Some of you might wish to join us in the DC chapter of the Sierra Club, either in our current outreach efforts or our more long-term aspirations to ban plastic bags and implement a beverage container deposit scheme. I hope that I've been able to demonstrate to you that what you throw away doesn't go away, and all the plastic packaging being introduced in our world can only be stopped if we learn how to prevent waste from happening in the first place. If we don't get this under control, we will continue to contribute to greenhouse gas emissions and environmental justice. Thank you so much for letting me share my experiences with you today and plant the seeds for your future endeavors. And thank you so much for caring about this issue and taking action by giving up single-use plastic for Lent. Bravo. Thank you. Do you have questions?
So we heard a lot.
That's a lot.
And I'm sure people have questions. So I have a mic here. If you'd like to ask Susan a question, raise your hand. And I see a lot already. And you can ask your question.
Well, do we need this? You mentioned that Montgomery County is doing very well with lowering their,
Waste diversion, yeah.
what are they doing that gives them this edge?
I don't know the details. I've just seen their numbers, which far exceed DC. Currently, DC has, on average, for residential waste diversion, and when I say waste diversion, that means not going to incinerators and not going to landfills. Our residential rate is 25%, but our citywide rate is 16.8%, and I think Montgomery County is closer to 30 or 40%. One of the things that they probably are doing and that we are trying to advocate in DC is beyond what I just talked about today in terms of banning the bags and having a beverage deposit law, is composting. Much of the waste that we're currently sending to landfills and incinerators could be composted. And the city has not agreed to invest in composting, in land, in order to provide areas that we can compost. Some of you shop at the farmers market, the DuPont farmers market, and so the government does set up compost collection facilities at the farmers markets once a week. You have to be pretty committed to do that. Where I lived in Switzerland, anywhere you lived, you could walk 500 meters and drop off your compost into an underground composting facility. So we need more distributed compost drop-off sites in the district.
Patty, I think you had a question?
One of the suggestions in the list of 100 was bring your own packaging to bulk products. So I was in Whole Foods a couple of weeks ago, and I said to them, can I bring my own package? And the response was, because of COVID, we're not doing it. So I wondered whether you were trying to address that issue too here in DC.
It's a very good point, Patty. And in the National Reuse Network, we've seen this kind of reaction being fueled by the plastic industry, about reusable bags and bringing your own containers. I asked Whole Foods just a week ago if I could bring in my own container. I didn't have one with me, and they said yes, and I could. This was at Tenleytown, and I could bring it in at customer service, and they would give me a tare weight for it that would be deducted when I brought it. So it's not something that we have worked on. We're a small volunteer-driven group of people, but I agree with you. It is something that we should be pushing for. It's very important, and it's something that you might want to do as well.
I go to P Street, and I wondered, could I refer to Tenleytown?
Yeah, I mean, that's what they told me. I haven't tried it yet, but I would, yeah, sure, why not? Why not?
Thank you. I really appreciated everything that you shared. Speaking of composting, I have a question. I subscribe to a food meal delivery service, and they provide the food in a compostable container, which I take to the DuPont market. And I'm wondering, if that is an option, why wouldn't the companies do that more? Is there a competition? Is there something? I realize you may not be familiar with this subject matter, but it seems like if it's possible, more companies maybe would convert to that.
Right. I mean, we
I
have
see less of it.
We have to be careful with things that claim to be compostable.
It says certified.
It says certified. The problem is DC itself, it might be certified for an industrial composting facility, which the district does not have. If it's certified to be home compostable, that's different. And probably, I don't know, it's Compost Crew or one of these other companies that picks up, I think, a DuPont Circle. They may be able to bring it to a place that has an industrial composter, but that is one of the impediments, is we don't really have truth in labeling for composting, and that is another thing that the Sierra Club, at the national level would like to push for, is to have truth in recycling and truth in composting laws, because it causes a lot of consumers confusion, and we think we're doing the right thing, but if that is not going to actually be composted, then is that really a good solution, or is it just a case of greenwashing? It sounds like probably if you're bringing it to DuPont Circle, they're probably bringing it somewhere and they're accepting it. That means it can be composted, so that's good. But the lack of industrial composting facilities is an impediment.
Anyone else like to ask a question? Oh, do we have any online? Sorry, thank you.
Go ahead, Ben. Yeah, hi. Thank you for that introduction to this talk. It was so much in depth. I have one comment and one question. The comment is that I work with zero waste here in the community. We live in Northern California when we're here. And we also try to keep all of those condiment things and plastic forks and stuff from being in the take-home stuff. My only comment on that is we recommend that you first just tell them rather than report them immediately. Sometimes it's an innocent thing, maybe a new worker or a small family restaurant, and you just say, you don't need to give me these things, maybe you should ask. If you get enough of that feedback, perhaps they will take it to heart and do that. And the second is, I have a question. So I'm wondering, I know the bottle industry, plastic bottle industry lobby is massive and well funded. Do you think they parsed out that bill in order to take the plastic bottle part out of it in order for the rest of it to pass? Because normally it seems that the more comprehensive bill would be the better way to go. I was wondering if you know why they did that. Thank you.
Sure. And just to respond on your comment, totally agree. And that's why, our first step is to be passing out these flyers. So we're going out to restaurants to help educate them about the new requirements. And there is no fining going on. So no restaurant is going to get faced with a fine until after July, by which point everybody should be aware of it. We did the same thing in DC when we passed a straw and stirrer ban. There was a 6-month grace period to help restaurants get on track. In terms of the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act and then the kind of standalone laws, I think the thinking is when we look at our Congress right now, it's very hard to get anything passed at all. So if you have a comprehensive act that includes, for example, a moratorium on building new plastic production facilities, which is essential, but you could imagine how senators and representatives in states where those production facilities are being built and is leading to some kind of employment, how they would fight that. So if you take the individual pieces out, some of them may pass, even if the more comprehensive piece of legislation can't pass. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Sure.
Do we have anyone more online who'd like to say something? No? Anyone here who hasn't spoken, who has a question? Okay, I think that's it. Thank you so much. Let's give another round.